flour coated my knuckles like cheap chalk the day Owen called my blackberry tart aggressively mediocre. I had spent 6 hours pitting fruit, my thumbnails stained purple like bruised flesh, just for him to push the plate away to answer a text. 10 minutes later, a distracted driver's truck crushed my sedan. Dying tasted like copper. Waking up smelled like browned butter. I was back in our cramped kitchen exactly 3 years ago. This time, he could buy his own damn cake. I blinked, and the blinding hospital lights dissolved into the warm, honeyed glow of the cheap pendant lamp hanging above our kitchen island. My lungs, which a second ago had been filled with the wet, horrifying rattle of my own blood, expanded violently. I sucked in a ragged breath of air that smelled sharply of pure vanilla extract toasted sugar and heating metal. My hands gripped the edge of the faux marble countertop. My knuckles were white trembling uncontrollably. Underneath my right hand sat a heavy glass bowl holding a pound of softened butter, perfectly aerated, waiting for the sugar. The KitchenAid mixer hummed its low, steady mechanical purr to my left. Whir, whir, whir. I stared at my fingers. There was no steering wheel imprinted on my palms in bruised purple and black. No shattered windshield glass dusted across my forearms like morbid glitter. My skin was intact, warm-dusted, only with a fine layer of all-purpose flour. My chest heaved. I pressed a floury hand directly against my sternum, digging my fingers into the soft tissue, right where the truck's grill had caved in my ribs. Nothing. Just the rapid, panicked thud of a healthy heart vibrating against my ribs. Then I looked at the calendar pinned to the corkboard next to the fridge. October 12th. Owen's 28th birthday. My knees gave out. I hit the linoleum floor hard enough to bruise the sudden dull pain shooting up my shins, serving as a violent necessary anchor to reality. I was breathing. I was here. I had somehow been violently shoved backward down the timeline landing exactly 3 years before my car was folded in half at the intersection of 4th and Elm. 3 years before I died, with the taste of Owen's profound indifference still coating my tongue. Aggressively mediocre, he had said. His exact words. I remembered the way his lip curled, barely looking up from his glowing phone screen as he shoved the delicate, painstakingly crimped pastry crust away from him. I remembered the cold, hollow pit in my stomach, the way I blindly grabbed my keys and stormed out just to breathe, driving straight into the path of a speeding freight truck. I sat on the floor, the cold chill of the kitchen tile seeping through my worn denim jeans. Up above the mixer kept spinning its empty paddle attachment against the sides of the bowl. Clack, clack, clack. Slowly, the paralysis broke. I dragged myself back up to my feet, using the cabinet handles for leverage. I looked at the prep station I had meticulously set up an hour ago. The imported dark chocolate chips, the espresso powder, the 3 layers of rich chocolate sponge cake currently baking in the oven, filling the small apartment with a thick, suffocating sweetness. Every year, I made Owen a masterpiece. Every year, it took 2 full days of preparation grocery runs and stressing over oven temperatures. Every year, he would take 2 bites, wipe his mouth with a napkin, and say something like, "A little dry this time, huh?" Or, "I really prefer the box mix my mom used to make." And every year, I swallowed the insult, convinced that if I just perfected the crumb, if I just balanced the ganache, he would finally look at me with the warmth I so desperately craved. What a pathetic, hollow little life I had lived. I reached over and flicked the mixer off. The sudden silence in the kitchen was deafening, broken only by the sharp ticking of the wall clock. I picked up the glass bowl full of perfectly creamed expensive butter. It was heavy. It felt real. Without a second thought, I walked over to the stainless steel trash can, stepped on the pedal, and dumped the entire bowl inside. The butter hit the plastic liner with a wet, heavy thud. I didn't stop there. I grabbed the little brown bottle of Madagascar vanilla. Trash. I took the sifted flour and rich cocoa powder. Trash. Then I opened the oven door. A blast of 350-degree heat hit my face instantly, drying the cold sweat on my forehead. The 3 cake rounds were rising beautifully, their dome tops just starting to crack, releasing the intoxicating aroma of blooming chocolate. I grabbed my silicone oven mitts. I pulled the hot metal pans out one by one and dumped the half-baked bubbling batter straight into the garbage. It sizzled violently against the cold butter, releasing a thick plume of steam that smelled like burnt sugar and wasted effort. I threw the dirty pans into the sink. They clattered loudly, a harsh metallic sound that sent a jolt of pure petty adrenaline straight through my veins. "What are you doing?" the voice came from the hallway. I froze my hands, still gripping the cold metal edge of the sink. Slowly, I turned around. Owen stood in the doorway, dressed in his crisp blue dress shirt, the top 2 buttons undone, holding his expensive leather briefcase. His dark hair was perfectly styled, not a strand out of place. He smelled like bergamot expensive coffee and the subtle lingering scent of a man who firmly believed the world owed him a favor. 3 years ago, I would have rushed over, kissed his cheek, and told him happy birthday. I would have apologized profusely for the mess in the kitchen. Today I just looked at him, really looked at him. I noticed the slight arrogant asymmetry of his jaw, the downward tilt of his eyebrows, the sheer boredom in his eyes. "I asked what you're doing," Owen repeated, stepping into the kitchen and glancing at the messy sink, then the smoking trash can. "It smells like something's burning. Are you ruining my cake?" My throat felt dry. I wanted to scream at him. I wanted to throw the heavy ceramic flour canister directly at his head. I wanted to ask him how he could let me drive away crying. But of course that hadn't happened yet. To him, I was just his slightly neurotic, overly eager girlfriend having a clumsy kitchen mishap. I swallowed hard-tasting bile. "No," I said, my voice coming out raspy, completely stripped of its usual soft fawning inflection. "I'm not ruining it." I pulled the oven mitts off and dropped them carelessly onto the counter. "I'm just not making it." Owen stared at me, his brow furrowing in genuine confusion. He wasn't angry yet. He was just baffled that the script had changed. "What do you mean you're not making it? People are coming over at 8. We need a cake." "Then go buy one," I said. I walked right past him, not caring that my flour-dusted shoulder brushed against his immaculate blue shirt. The bathroom door locked behind me with a solid, satisfying click. I sank down onto the closed toilet seat and pressed the heels of my hands into my eyes until bursts of static color exploded in the darkness. My chest was vibrating. It wasn't the heroic, triumphant high you see in movies when a woman finally stands up for herself. It was a messy, nauseating panic. My armpits were sweating and my stomach churned with the sour acid of conflict. I had spent 4 years conditioning myself to avoid Owen's displeasure at all costs. The neural pathways of my brain were literally wired to appease him. Breaking that cycle felt like tearing a muscle. Through the thin apartment walls, I heard him pacing heavily in the kitchen. A cabinet slammed shut. "Faye," his voice muffled through the drywall. Are you throwing a tantrum because I asked you to iron my gray slacks last night? Is that what this is? I let out a short, breathy laugh that sounded more like a cough. He couldn't even fathom that my refusal to bake his cake had anything to do with him simply being unbearable. It had to be a petty transactional grievance. I stood up and turned on the cold water in the sink. I splashed my face watching the water turn cloudy with flour as it swirled down the drain. I looked at myself in the mirror. I looked younger, softer, the stress lines around my eyes completely erased by the brutal reset of the universe. I wasn't going to waste this face or this pulse on a man who treated my devotion like a cheap commodity. By the time I walked out of the bathroom, Owen was sitting on the living room sofa, aggressively scrolling through his phone. I ordered a cake from the bakery down the street, he said, without looking up, his voice dripping with condescension. Since you decided to have a meltdown, it cost me $40. Tragic, I murmured, walking past him to grab my jacket from the hall tree. He finally looked up, his thumb stopping on the screen. Where are you going? The guys will be here in 2 hours. Out, I said, slipping my arms into the faded denim. I'll be back. I didn't have a plan. I just needed to be out of that apartment, away from the smell of the burnt chocolate, still lingering in the trash. I walked down the 3 flights of stairs and pushed through the heavy glass doors into the crisp October air. The shock of the cold wind against my wet hairline felt like a baptism. I walked for an hour, aimlessly navigating the cracked sidewalks of my neighborhood. The sensory input of the world felt dialed up to a 10. The screech of a bus braking made me flinch. The smell of roasting nuts from a street cart made my mouth water. I was alive. It was absurd, terrifying, and profoundly isolating. Who do you call to say, hey, I died in a car crash 3 years from now because my boyfriend insulted my tart, and now I'm back. I ended up at a cheap diner a few blocks from our apartment. I sat in a sticky vinyl booth that smelled faintly of bleach and stale fries, ordering a black coffee and a piece of cherry pie. When the tired waitress set it down, the pie crust was pale and soggy, the filling clearly poured straight from an industrial can, oozing a neon, unnatural red. I took a bite. It was cloyingly sweet, the gelatinous texture clinging to the roof of my mouth. It was objectively terrible. I ate every single bite. It was the best thing I had ever tasted, simply because I didn't have to worry if someone else thought it was mediocre. When I finally returned to the apartment, it was 8:30. The low thrum of bass vibrated through the floorboards before I even put my key in the lock. Owen's friends had arrived. I pushed the door open. The apartment was crowded with half a dozen guys in business, casual, holding condensation-slicked bottles of IPA. The air was thick with the smell of beer cologne and the distinct greasy aroma of takeout pizzas stacked precariously on the coffee table. "Faye," shouted Wyatt, one of Owen's obnoxious co-workers, raising his bottle. "The elusive girlfriend appears. Owen said you were out running errands." I glanced at Owen. He was standing near the kitchen island, his jaw tight, giving me a warning glare. "Don't embarrass me," his eyes practically screamed. "Just needed some fresh air," I said, smoothly, taking off my jacket. I walked toward the kitchen, my boots clicking softly against the hardwood. Sitting in the center of the island was the cake Owen had panic ordered. It wasn't from the artisan bakery down the street. It was from the big box grocery store on the corner. A glaringly rectangular sheet cake, frosted in stiff, plasticky white icing with "Happy Birthday." Owen piped in a garish neon blue gel that was already bleeding into the white. It was magnificent in its mediocrity. So Faye, Wyatt leaned against the counter, eyeing the cardboard box. Usually you whip up some crazy 10-tier architectural wonder for this guy. What happened? Get tired of spoiling him? Owen stepped forward, his smile strained, forcing a light chuckle. She just didn't have time this year, Wyatt. Work's been busy. Actually, I said, my voice cutting cleanly through the ambient noise of the party. The room didn't go completely silent, but the immediate vicinity quieted down. I reached over and popped the plastic tabs off the cake dome. The smell of artificial vanilla and cheap preservatives wafted up. I just decided he didn't appreciate the good stuff, I said, meeting Owen's eyes directly. So I figured he'd be happier with something a little more his speed. Owen's face flushed a deep mottled red. The silence stretched thick and uncomfortable. Wyatt cleared his throat, suddenly finding the label on his beer bottle intensely fascinating. I didn't stick around to manage Owen's fragile ego. I reached down, dug my bare index finger straight into the neon blue gel. Icing scooped up a generous dollop and popped it into my mouth. The sugar grit crunched between my teeth. Happy birthday, Owen. I smiled, licking my finger. Enjoy the cake. Silence settled over the apartment like a heavy, suffocating blanket the moment the front door clicked shut behind the last guest. Wyatt had been the last to leave, offering a strained, overly loud goodbye that neither of us returned. Now it was just me, Owen, and the wreckage of a Tuesday night birthday party. Empty beer bottles cluttered every flat surface, their paper labels peeling from condensation. A rogue slice of pepperoni pizza lay congealing on a greasy paper plate near the television screen. In the kitchen, the neon blue grocery store cake sat half-eaten, the plastic dome discarded on the linoleum floor. It looked pathetic. It looked exactly like our relationship cheap hastily assembled and leaving a bad taste in your mouth. Owen didn't yell immediately. That wasn't his style. He preferred the slow, methodical dismantling of my self-esteem. He took off his suit jacket, draped it meticulously over the back of a dining chair, and rolled up his crisp shirt sleeves. The faint rustle of the expensive cotton sounded deafening in the quiet room. I stood by the sink running hot water over a yellow sponge, though I wasn't washing anything. I just wanted the scalding warmth against my hands. I was shivering. It was a residual, deep-bone chill left over from the shock of waking up alive, mixed with the adrenaline crash of the last 3 hours. So, Owen began, his voice dangerously soft. He leaned against the doorframe, crossing his arms. His eyes were dark, calculating. Are you going to explain what that performance was? I squeezed the sponge. Hot soapy water trickled down my wrists and splashed against the stainless steel basin. It wasn't a performance, right? You humiliating me in front of my coworkers was just a spontaneous act of malice. He let out a sharp, incredulous breath, shaking his head. You know, if you were angry about me asking you to pick up the dry cleaning, you could have just acted like an adult and talked to me. Instead, you throw a tantrum, ruin my birthday, and serve a piece of garbage from aisle 4. Old habits flared up in my chest. A pathetic, conditioned panic tightened my throat, tasting like copper and ash. For 4 years, that exact tone meant I was supposed to crumble. I was supposed to drop the sponge rush over and apologize until my voice went hoarse. My brain frantically fired off the warning signals. He's mad. Fix it. Smooth it over. Make yourself smaller. But then I remembered the crunch of the steering column against my ribs. I remembered the metallic tang of blood pooling in the back of my throat the smell of burning rubber, the absolute terrifying finality of the dark. I remember dying alone, knowing the last thing I gave this man was a 6-hour pastry that he pushed away to check his email. I turned off the faucet. The sudden silence made Owen flinch just a fraction of an inch, but I caught it. "I didn't ruin your birthday, Owen," I said, drying my hands on a checkered dish towel. My voice sounded foreign to me, flat hollowed out, completely devoid of the frantic, eager-to-please pitch he was used to. I just stopped performing the labor of making it special. If the absence of my effort ruins your day, maybe you should think about that. His jaw tightened. A muscle ticked near his ear. He hated being psychoanalyzed. He hated when I used what he called therapy words. "Don't give me that feminist garbage," he snapped, pushing off the doorframe. He took 2 steps into the kitchen, his tall frame looming over the island. It was a physical intimidation tactic he used without even realizing it. "You baked a cake. You threw it away because you were feeling petty. You bought a cheap replacement to spite me. It's childish, Faye. It's embarrassing." I looked at him. The bergamot cologne, the perfectly styled hair, the condescending set of his shoulders. I felt a sudden overwhelming wave of exhaustion. How had I ever found this man impressive? How had I spent years treating him like the sun, terrified of the shadows he cast? The illusion was gone, leaving behind a desperately insecure man in a slightly stained button-down. "You're right," I said simply. Owen blinked. His momentum faltered. He was geared up for an argument, ready to systematically tear down my defenses until I was crying on the kitchen tiles. My sudden agreement threw him completely off balance. "Excuse me, you're right. It is childish. This whole thing is embarrassing." I tossed the damp dish towel onto the counter. It landed with a soft, wet smack. "I'm embarrassed that I spent 2 days sourcing single-origin cocoa powder for a man who thinks basic decency is an unreasonable expectation. I'm embarrassed that I let you treat me like an unpaid appliance. But most of all, I'm embarrassed that it took me this long to realize I don't actually like you." His face went completely slack. For the first time in our relationship, Owen looked genuinely speechless. His mouth opened, but no sound came out. The arrogance drained from his features, leaving a confused, deeply average-looking man standing in a messy kitchen. "What are you saying?" He finally managed his voice, dropping the patronizing edge, replaced by a thin thread of actual panic. "I'm going to bed," I said, walking past him. I didn't brush his shoulder this time. I gave him a wide berth, repulsed by the sheer proximity of him. "I'll pack my things tomorrow." "Faye, stop." He reached out his fingers, catching my wrist. I jerked my arm back so violently, I knocked a plastic cup off the counter. It clattered against the linoleum, spinning loudly in the silence. My heart slammed against my ribs. The phantom pain in my chest flared hot and sharp, a ghostly echo of crushed bone. "Don't!" I breathed, my voice trembling, though not from fear. It was pure, unadulterated rage. It felt clean. It felt blinding. "Don't touch me, ever again." He took a step back, his hands raised defensively, eyes wide. He looked at me like I was a stranger. Good. I walked into the bedroom, shut the door, and locked it. I didn't turn on the lights. I crawled into the bed, fully clothed, pulling the heavy duvet up to my chin. The sheet smelled like his expensive detergent, and it made my stomach turn, but I was too exhausted to care. I lay there in the dark, staring at the ceiling, listening to the muffled sounds of Owen angrily throwing empty beer bottles into the recycling bin. I was 25 again. I was alive. And I had absolutely no idea what I was going to do tomorrow. Morning arrived with the harsh, unforgiving scrape of a garbage truck backing up outside the window. I woke up with a violent jolt, my hands flying to my chest, searching for a seatbelt that wasn't there. My breath came in shallow, frantic gasps until the panic slowly subsided, replaced by the dull ache of an unyielding mattress and the stale smell of day-old cologne trapped in the carpet fibers. Sunlight filtered through the cheap vinyl blinds, casting horizontal yellow bars across the room. I sat up. Every muscle in my body felt heavy, steeped in a profound existential fatigue. But underneath the exhaustion was a tight electric hum of urgency. I had to get out. I threw off the covers and walked out of the bedroom. The apartment was completely quiet. Owen's briefcase was missing from the entryway console, and his keys were gone from the ceramic dish. A sticky yellow post-it note was slapped against the bathroom mirror. "Call me when you've calmed down. We need to talk about rent." I stared at his cramped, slanted handwriting. He actually thought this was a negotiation. He thought I was throwing a tantrum over chores and that a good night's sleep would reset me back to factory settings. A bitter laugh scraped the back of my throat. I crumpled the note, feeling the sticky adhesive cling to my thumb, and tossed it into the trash can. Moving out of a shared life is rarely cinematic. It isn't just throwing clothes into a dramatic suitcase and slamming a door in the rain. It's a tedious, agonizing dissection of ownership. Who bought the toaster? Whose name is on the internet bill? Which spatulas are mine? I started in the kitchen. I didn't touch the dishes, the matching ceramic pots, or the expensive espresso machine I had bought him for Christmas last year. Let him keep the material things. Instead, I opened the pantry and reached for the top shelf. My baking supplies. I pulled down the heavy glass jars of bread flour, the imported vanilla beans sealed in wax paper, the specialized fluted tart tins, and the digital kitchen scale. I loaded them into a cardboard box I found out by the dumpsters earlier that morning. The glass clinked together, a heavy, reassuring sound. These weren't just tools. They were the only things in this apartment that actually belonged to my soul. I spent 3 hours stripping my existence from the rooms. I packed my clothes, leaving his side of the closet, looking hollow and lopsided. I took my books from the living room shelves. I packed the cheap, colorful throw pillows I had bought to brighten up Owen's sterile gray decor. By noon, I had 5 mismatched boxes and 2 suitcases stacked precariously by the front door. My phone buzzed in my back pocket. I pulled it out, wiping a streak of dust from the screen. Incoming call mom. My thumb hovered over the red decline button. The last time I spoke to her in my previous timeline was a week before the crash. She had spent 20 minutes telling me I needed to be more patient with Owen, that men his age were just focused on their careers, and that I was lucky to have someone with such a stable income to look after me. I pressed accept. "Hi, Mom. Faye, honey." Her voice crackled through the speaker, crisp and mildly disapproving, exactly as I remembered. "Owen just texted me. He says you two had a fight and you're talking crazy. What's going on? Are you packing?" A cold wave of disgust washed over me. Owen hadn't even bothered to call me first. He went straight to my mother to manage me. He knew she was an ally in keeping the peace. He knew she valued a good resume over a good heart. "I'm moving out," I said, wedging the phone between my ear and shoulder as I taped up the last box. The sharp rip of the packing tape echoed loudly in the empty living room. Moving out, Faye, don't be dramatic. Every couple fights. You can't just throw away a 4-year relationship because he didn't like a cake. He told me you threw away his birthday cake. He called you about a cake, Mom. I stopped taping. I pressed my hands flat against the top of the cardboard box, leaning my weight into it. I'm 25 years old. My boyfriend called my mother to tattle on me because I didn't bake him a pastry. Does that sound like a relationship you want me to salvage? Silence stretched on the other end of the line. I could hear the faint manufactured applause of her daytime television shows in the background. He's a good provider, Faye. She finally said, her tone defensive, clinging to the only metric she understood. You're not exactly pulling in a massive salary at the logistics firm. The city is expensive. You need to think practically. I am thinking practically. I closed my eyes, inhaling the smell of cardboard and dust. I'm practically suffocating. I'll call you when I'm settled. I hung up before she could protest. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from the massive, terrifying vacuum I was creating in my own life. I had no apartment. I had a mediocre administrative job that barely paid enough for a studio. I had a trunk full of flour and clothes. I carried the boxes down the 3 flights of stairs one by one. My thighs burned sweat pooling at the base of my neck. The physical exertion felt incredible. By the time I loaded the last suitcase into my dented 10-year-old sedan, the exact same car that had become my metal coffin, 3 years in the future, my lungs were burning. I sat in the driver's seat and gripped the steering wheel. The plastic was hot from the afternoon sun. I ran my thumbs over the worn grooves. There was no blood, no shattered glass, just the dusty dashboard and the smell of stale air conditioning. I turned the key. The engine sputtered, then caught roaring to life with a familiar, clunky rhythm. I pulled out of the parking lot, merging onto the busy street. I didn't leave a note. I didn't leave a forwarding address. I just drove away, watching the sterile gray apartment complex shrink in the rearview mirror until it disappeared completely behind a line of oak trees. For the first time since waking up in that kitchen, I took a breath that reached all the way to the bottom of my lungs. Rubber squeaked against wet asphalt as I pulled into the parking lot of the Motor Lodge on Route 9. It was the kind of place that didn't ask for a security deposit and definitely didn't bleach its shower curtains. I paid for 3 nights in cash, sliding the damp bills under a scratched plexiglass window, to a clerk who didn't even bother to look up from his phone. Room 114 smelled profoundly of stale cigarette smoke, masked by an aggressive chemical pine spray. I dropped my bags onto the carpet. The floorboards groaned beneath my boots. I sat on the edge of the mattress, listening to the erratic rattling of the window AC unit, and pulled out my phone. 14 missed calls. 11 from Owen. 3 from my mother. I turned the phone off, completely tossing it onto the cheap veneer nightstand. The silence in the room was absolute, heavy and thick. There was no hum of a stand mixer, no television playing in the background, no distant thud of Owen pacing the hardwood floors. Just me, the smell of cheap cleaner, and the terrifying hollow expanse of my own autonomy. I lay back against the stiff pillows, fully clothed, and stared at the water stain on the ceiling until my vision blurred. I didn't cry. I was too empty to cry. I just slept, dropping into a dark, dreamless void. Morning hit like a physical blow. The alarm on my phone chirped its default obnoxious tone at 6:30. I dragged myself out of bed, my spine aching from the sagging mattress. I washed my face in a sink that drained too slowly, put on a wrinkled gray blouse from my suitcase, and drove to my job at the logistics firm. Entering the office felt like stepping into a vacuum. The fluorescent lights buzzed with a low, headache-inducing frequency. The air smelled of stale break room coffee ozone from the constantly jamming Xerox machine and damp wool sweaters. I sat at my cubicle staring at the dual monitors, spreadsheets, shipping manifests, pallet weights. 3 years from now, I knew exactly what would happen here. Nothing. Absolutely nothing. I would still be sitting in this exact chair, making 3% more a year, spending my lunch breaks, looking up recipes for laminated dough on Pinterest, while Owen texted me to pick up his protein powder on the way home. I knew that in 8 months the company would undergo a minor restructuring, and I'd be moved 2 desks closer to the bathroom. I knew that Nina, the receptionist currently filing her nails at the front desk, would leave to marry a dentist. I knew I was going to die a low-level administrative assistant who baked out of a desperate need to be loved. "Faye," a voice droned over my shoulder. I didn't flinch. I slowly turned my chair. Mr. Peterson, the regional manager, stood there holding a stack of laminated invoices. He had mustard on his tie and a permanent expression of mild irritation. "You didn't CC me on the freight manifest for the Denver shipment yesterday," he said, tapping the papers against my desk. "We talked about this. Attention to detail, Faye. It's not that complicated. Yesterday, he was talking about yesterday. The day I spent 6 hours making a tart, got dumped, emotionally drove into a semi-truck in an alternate timeline, woke up 3 years in the past, dumped my boyfriend, and moved into a motel. The Denver shipment." I repeated, my voice devoid of any inflection. "Yes, it delayed the loading dock by 20 minutes. Let's not make a habit of this, okay? You're usually so reliable." He dropped the folders into my inbox tray with a heavy thud. "Get those sorted before lunch." He turned to walk away. My hands rested flat on my keyboard. The plastic keys felt cheap under my fingertips. I looked at the gray fabric walls of my cubicle. I thought about the heavy glass jars of flour sitting in the trunk of my car. I thought about the crunch of metal, the taste of blood, the absolute paralyzing regret of a life unlived. No. The word slipped out of my mouth before my brain even processed the command. It wasn't loud, but in the muted, carpeted silence of the office floor, it rang like a bell. Mr. Peterson stopped. He turned back slowly, his brow furrowing. "Excuse me." I pushed my chair back. The wheels squeaked loudly. I stood up. My legs felt shaky, but my chest felt incredibly light. It was the same feeling I had when I dumped the cake batter into the trash. "I said no, Mr. Peterson," I said, meeting his eyes. "I'm not going to sort those before lunch. I'm actually not going to sort them ever." Nina stopped filing her nails. The typing from the adjacent cubicles ceased. "Faye, if this is a joke, it's not a very good one. Sit down." "I don't want to sit down," I said, grabbing my purse from the bottom drawer. "I am profoundly, aggressively bored, Mr. Peterson. This job is a graveyard, and I am not spending my second chance at life tracking pallets of dog food." He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, the mustard stain on his tie, suddenly looking very sad. "Second chance at Faye? Have you been drinking?" "I quit," I said, slinging my purse over my shoulder. I didn't pack anything else. There was nothing on that desk that belonged to me anyway. No photos of Owen, no potted plants, just company pens and sticky notes. I walked down the narrow aisle between the cubicles, my boots sinking into the cheap commercial carpet. I pushed through the heavy glass double doors and stepped into the hallway. My heart was hammering a wild, erratic rhythm against my ribs. I had no safety net. I had $300 in my checking account, a trunk full of baking supplies, and a motel room that smelled like despair. I pushed the elevator button. I was completely unmoored, drifting in the terrifying current of my own choices. I smiled a tight manic pull of my lips and stepped into the elevator car. I was ruined, and I had never felt better. Rain slicked the windshield of my sedan as I drove aimlessly through the industrial district on the south side of the city. The windshield wipers squeaked, smearing the water into blurry neon streaks from the streetlights. I needed a kitchen. Not a domestic galley with a weak oven, but a real commercial space. My brain flipped through the catalog of my future memories. I remembered a small independent coffee shop on 8th Street. The daily grind. No too corporate. Wait, a bakery. A tiny failing bakery called Crumbs. In my previous timeline, Owen and I had walked past it on our way to a pretentious brunch spot. I remembered seeing the going out of business sign taped to the window about a year from now. The owner was an older guy, always looking exhausted, smoking cigarettes by the back alley door. I took a sharp right, my tires hissing against the wet asphalt. Crumbs was wedged between a dry cleaner and a vacant storefront. The paint on the sign was peeling, and the front window was fogged with condensation. I parked at the meter, pulled my hood up against the drizzle, and pushed the front door open. A small brass bell jingled weakly. The air inside was warm, thick with the smell of scorched coffee yeast and old grease. The display case was practically empty, holding only a few sad pale muffins and a singular dry-looking croissant. A man emerged from the back kitchen. He looked exactly as I remembered, from my peripheral future memory, late 50s, receding hairline flour, dusting his dark apron like a permanent shadow. He wiped his hands on a rag, looking at me with the weary indifference of a man who hadn't seen a profitable day in a decade. "We're closing in 10 minutes, he grunted, not bothering to smile. "Just got the muffins left. Half price." "I don't want a muffin," I said, walking up to the scratched glass counter. I looked past him, trying to catch a glimpse of the kitchen. I could see the gleaming stainless steel of a massive deck oven and the heavy cast iron bulk of a commercial planetary mixer. My hands actually itched. "Then what do you want bathrooms for paying customers?" "I want to rent your kitchen," I said flatly. He stopped wiping his hands. He looked at me, really looked at me this time, taking in my wet hair, my wrinkled gray blouse, and the manic, desperate energy vibrating off my skin. "Rent my kitchen," he repeated slowly. "Lady, this is a bakery, not a timeshare." "Your bakery is dying," I said. It was cruel, but I didn't have the luxury of tact. I pointed to the empty display case. "It's noon on a Wednesday, and you have nothing to sell. The coffee smells burnt. Your pastry dough is overworked. I can tell just by looking at the lamination on that croissant. You're bleeding money." His face flushed dark red. He threw the rag onto the counter. "Get the hell out of my shop. My name is Faye." I pushed on, ignoring the directive, leaning my forearms against the cold glass. "I need a commercial space. You need product that people actually want to eat. Let me bake tonight. I'll provide my own ingredients. Tomorrow morning you put my stuff in your case. You keep 60% of the profit from what I sell. I take 40. If it doesn't sell, I walk away and you lose nothing." He glared at me, his jaw working as he chewed on the inside of his cheek. The rain tapped against the front window, filling the heavy silence. He was proud, but he was also broke. I recognized the specific exhaustion in his eyes. It was the exhaustion of carrying a heavy, useless thing for too long. "What kind of stuff?" he muttered finally, his voice defensive. "Not this," I gestured vaguely to the sad muffins. "Real food, food with a soul." He stared at me for another long, uncomfortable minute. Then he let out a harsh, rasping sigh, reaching into his apron pocket to pull out a ring of keys. "I'm Arthur, and if you burn my place down, I'm locking you inside." 2 hours later, I was hauling my heavy glass jars of flour from the trunk of my car through the alleyway door. The commercial kitchen was a mess, flour caked in the corners, grease traps that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, but the equipment was solid. I tied one of Arthur's spare aprons around my waist. The canvas was stiff and smelled like old dough. I stood in front of the massive stainless steel prep table. I didn't have a recipe in mind. I didn't have a plan. For the last 4 years, every time I baked, I was solving a math equation. If I use less sugar, will Owen complain about the calories? If I make it chocolate, will he say it's too rich? Now there were no variables, just me, the butter, and the heat. I decided on a galette, rustic, ugly, and honest. I dumped flour onto the steel table. I took cold, unsalted butter and began cutting it in by hand, feeling the chunks of fat coat themselves in the flour. My fingers moved mechanically at first, then found a rhythm. I pressed the dough together, not overworking it, letting the shaggy, imperfect edges remain. While the dough chilled, I sliced tart green apples and dark bruised plums, tossing them with brown sugar cardamom and a heavy splash of cheap bourbon I found in a cabinet. The smell hit the air, sharp and intoxicating spice, alcohol, and dark fruit. I rolled out the dough. It wasn't a perfect circle. It was jagged, asymmetrical. I dumped the fruit in the center and folded the edges up, roughly sealing in the juices. I brushed the crust with heavy cream and coated it in coarse sugar. When I slid the heavy metal sheet pans into the deck oven, the heat blasted my face, instantly curling the damp hairs around my forehead. 45 minutes later, I pulled them out. The butter in the crust had shattered perfectly, creating thousands of flaky golden layers. The fruit juices had bubbled over in some spots, caramelizing into sticky, dark, chewy candy against the parchment paper. It smelled like autumn, like comfort, like absolute defiance. Arthur walked into the kitchen just as I was sliding the galettes onto the cooling racks. He didn't say anything. He just picked up a paring knife, cut a messy triangle from the edge of the nearest pastry, and picked it up. The hot plum juice dripped onto his fingers, but he didn't care. He took a bite. I watched his throat swallow. I watched his eyes close for a fraction of a second. The crunch of the crust echoed loudly in the quiet kitchen. He opened his eyes, looking at the half-eaten pastry in his hand, then looked at me. "You take 50%, Arthur said gruffly, turning his back to me to pour a cup of water. "And you clean the grease traps before you leave." I looked at the cooling pastries, the sugar glistening under the harsh fluorescent lights. A slow, genuine smile cracked across my face, pulling at the dry skin of my cheeks. I was exhausted, smelling like bourbon and butter, standing in a failing bakery on the bad side of town. It was perfect. Steam hissed violently from the espresso machine, sending a thick white cloud toward the water-stained ceiling tiles. For the first time in years, Arthur was actually tamping the grounds properly. The smell of dark roasted coffee beans cut sharply through the heavy aroma of caramelized sugar and melted butter filling the tiny storefront. It was Friday morning, 3 days since I walked out of the logistics firm. The display case, usually a graveyard for pale muffins, was completely sold out by 9 o'clock. My arms ached with a deep lactic burn. I had been awake since 2 in the morning, laminating dough-folding butter blocks into flour and rolling out sheets of pastry until my shoulders screamed. My apron was caked in a thick layer of white dust. A streak of blackberry jam was drying into a sticky patch on my jawline. I had never looked worse. I had never felt better. The brass bell above the door jingled a sharp metallic sound that usually signaled another customer looking for the apple galettes. I wiped my hands on a heavily stained rag and turned toward the counter. Owen stood in the doorway. He was wearing his casual Friday Patagonia vest over a tailored gingham shirt, looking completely out of place against the peeling linoleum and fogged windows of the bakery. The ambient noise of the street outside seemed to mute itself. He didn't look angry. He looked profoundly irritatingly disappointed. "Your mother told me you turned off your phone," Owen said. His eyes scanned the small space, taking in the empty glass case, the crooked menus, and finally my flour-covered appearance. His upper lip curled in a micro-expression of disgust. "I had to check the location tracker on our shared car insurance app just to make sure you weren't dead in a ditch." "I'm not dead," I said. My voice was perfectly steady. The paralyzing conditioned fear that used to grip my throat whenever he disapproved of me was entirely gone. It was like trying to flex a phantom limb. "I'm working," he scoffed, taking 3 slow steps into the shop. "Working, right. Mr. Peterson called me yesterday. He said you had a psychological break in the middle of the office and walked out. Faye, what is this? Are you having a quarter-life crisis? A bakery? In this neighborhood?" He gestured vaguely toward the window where a homeless man was currently shouting at a pigeon. "The neighborhood is fine. The flour is cheap." I tossed the rag onto the counter. It hit the laminate with a damp slap. "What do you want, Owen?" "I want you to stop acting like a child and come home," he said, using the exact tone one might use to coax a stray dog off the highway. He leaned his forearms against the glass case, invading my space. "You made your point. You're upset. I get it. But you're throwing away a steady paycheck to play pretend in a kitchen that looks like a health code violation. I'm not going to cover your half of the rent while you do this." He played his trump card, financial insecurity. 3 years ago, the threat of not making rent would have sent me into a spiral of apologies and frantic backpedaling. I reached into the front pocket of my jeans. My fingers brushed against the heavy plastic fob of my car keys. The sedan. The silver 10-year-old metal box that was destined to be crushed by a freight truck at the intersection of 4th and Elm. Just looking at the vehicle parked outside made my sternum ache with phantom pain. I hadn't wanted to drive it since I left the apartment. I pulled the keys out and dropped them on the glass counter. They clattered loudly between us. "Keep the car," I said. Owen frowned, looking down at the keys, then back up at my face. "What? Keep it. The title is in the glove box. It's technically mine, but consider it a parting gift. Sell it, drive it, I don't care. That should cover my half of the lease break." "Faye, be reasonable." "I don't want the car, Owen," I interrupted, leaning closer. The smell of his bergamot cologne was entirely overpowered by the sharp scent of raw yeast clinging to my skin. "I don't want the apartment. I don't want the espresso machine, or the matching towels, or you. I am completely permanently done. Do not track my phone again. Do not call my mother. If you walk into this bakery again, I will have Arthur hit you with a rolling pin." In the back kitchen, Arthur dropped a metal sheet pan. The The deafening crash echoed through the shop right on cue. Owen stared at me. The condescending mask finally slipped, replaced by genuine naked shock. He looked at the keys, realizing I wasn't negotiating. I was severing the limb to escape the trap. Without a word, he snatched the heavy fob off the glass, his knuckles turning white. He turned on his heel and pushed through the door. I watched through the fogged window as he aggressively clicked the unlock button, got into my silver sedan, and peeled away from the curb. He was taking the coffin with him. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. My knees shook, a sudden violent tremor that forced me to grip the edge of the counter. It was over. The timeline was definitively broken. I wasn't going to be in that car. Boyfriend. Arthur grunted, emerging from the back with a fresh tray of perfectly proofed croissants ready for the oven. I corrected, wiping a stray tear of pure adrenaline from my cheek, leaving a smear of flour in its wake. Good, Arthur muttered, not looking up. He looked like the kind of guy who complains about the crust being too hard. Oven's hot, let's go. Blisters formed on the webbing of my hands, tight little bubbles of fluid that stung every time I gripped a spatula. It had been 3 weeks since I handed Owen the keys to my death sentence. 3 weeks of sleeping on a lumpy mattress in the claustrophobic storage room above the bakery, which Arthur let me use in exchange for managing the morning prep. The room smelled entirely of bleach and old dust, but it was mine. No condescension, no tiptoeing around a fragile male ego. Just the dull, throbbing ache of manual labor and the quiet satisfaction of a rising bank account. Word of mouth had spread through the neighborhood like spilled ink. We weren't just selling out of galettes anymore. The display case was packed daily with sour cherry scones, dark chocolate rye cookies sprinkled with sea salt, and thick rustic loaves of sourdough that cracked audibly when you squeezed them. People were lining up outside before we even flipped the open sign. But success in a failing kitchen comes with a heavy tax. At 4 a.m. on a Tuesday, the giant commercial Hobart mixer finally gave up the ghost. It didn't go quietly. I was in the middle of a massive triple batch of brioche dough, 60 pounds of flour butter, and eggs churning violently in the heavy steel bowl. Suddenly the machine shrieked a high-pitched metallic grind that set my teeth on edge. A thick, acrid plume of black smoke shot out from the motor housing, smelling sharply of melted rubber and ozone. I slapped the red emergency stop button. The dough hook jerked to a halt, sinking lifelessly into the pale yellow mass. Arthur came jogging out of the back office, clutching a half-empty mug of black coffee. He took one look at the smoking machine, then at the massive bowl of half-mixed dough, and let out a string of curses that would make a sailor blush. "Motor's fried," he spat, waving the smoke away from his face. "Damn thing has been threatening to do this for a year. I don't have the grand to fix it right now." I stared into the bowl. We had a standing order with a trendy cafe 2 streets over. They needed 4 dozen brioche buns by 8 o'clock, or we lost the contract. The contract was currently paying for the new refrigeration unit we desperately needed. "We mix it by hand," I said, my voice deadpan. Arthur looked at me like I had lost my mind. "Faye, that's 60 pounds of highly enriched dough. It's basically cement until the gluten develops. You'll tear your rotator cuff." "Do you want to call the cafe and tell them we're defaulting?" I asked, grabbing the edge of the heavy stainless steel bowl. I didn't wait for his answer. I hauled the mass of sticky, dense dough out of the bowl and slammed it onto the floured prep bench. It hit the metal with a wet, heavy thud. I dug my hands into the mass. It was cold, stiff, and incredibly stubborn. For the first 10 minutes, it was purely mechanical. Press, stretch, fold. The dough stuck to my forearms, tearing the hair on my skin. The butter made everything slippery, fighting against the flour's attempt to bind. My shoulders began to burn, a sharp, searing heat radiating down my spine. "Move!" Arthur grunted, stepping up to the bench opposite me. He had taken off his apron and rolled up his sleeves. His forearms were corded with old muscle, scarred from decades of oven burns. We didn't speak. We fell into a brutal rhythmic dance. I would stretch and fold the top half. He would grab the bottom, turning the massive pile of weight with a violent shove. Slap. Fold. Turn. Sweat stung my eyes. The blisters on my hands popped the raw skin, rubbing directly against the abrasive salt in the dough. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood. Every time my muscles threatened to give out, I thought about the logistics firm. I thought about the perfectly ironed gray slacks Owen demanded I maintain. I thought about the neon blue grocery store cake. I poured every ounce of my past life's humiliation directly into the bench. I was physically, violently extracting the weakness from my own body, working it out through the friction of my hands against the table. An hour passed. The air in the kitchen was thick and humid with our body heat. Slowly, the dough began to change. The shaggy, sticky mess yielded. It smoothed out the butter, fully incorporating the gluten strands, finally aligning into a strong, elastic web. It became a beautiful pale yellow sphere, soft as a bruised cheek, springing back immediately when poked. I stepped back, my chest heaving. My arms were completely numb. I wiped my forehead with the back of my wrist, leaving a streak of butter across my brow. Arthur leaned heavily against the table, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He looked at the perfect mound of dough, then looked up at me. His eyes, usually clouded with cynical defeat, held a sharp, begrudging respect. "Not bad, kid," he wheezed, grabbing a bench scraper to start dividing the buns. I smiled, my lips dry and cracking. My body was entirely broken, my bank account was laughable, and my hands were bleeding. Yet staring at that 60-pound mound of dough we had conquered through sheer stubborn will, I felt an overwhelming, terrifying surge of affection. I cared about this. I cared about the bakery. I cared about the bread. It was a dangerous realization. Caring was what got me killed the first time. But as the smell of the proofing yeast bloomed in the warm kitchen, I realized the difference. This wasn't desperate devotion, looking for scraps of validation. This was power. And nobody could push it away to check their phone. Frost spiderwebbed across the front glass of the bakery, distorting the harsh amber glare of the streetlights into soft, fractured halos. It was late December. The morning air outside was a bitter, biting 0 degrees, but inside the kitchen, it was a humid 85. I stood at the stainless steel prep bench, dragging a heavy wooden rolling pin across a sheet of chilled dough. The butter trapped between the layers of flour cracked softly, a sound like distant snapping twigs. My forearms were corded with lean muscle I hadn't possessed 6 months ago. A pale, shiny burn scar curved along my left wrist, a permanent souvenir from the deck oven. I traced my thumb over it briefly, feeling the smooth, tight skin. It felt like a metal. Arthur was by the espresso machine, banging the portafilter against the knockbox. The sharp, rhythmic thwack anchored me to the present. The bakery wasn't just surviving, it was vibrating with life. We had repainted the peeling walls a warm, matty terracotta. The display case, once a graveyard of pale muffins, now held rows of laminated pastries, burnt Basque cheesecakes, and thick slices of dense, heavily seeded rye. The brass bell above the door jingled, letting in a violent rush of freezing air that made the overhead pendant lights sway. I didn't look up immediately. I was using a bench scraper to trim the ragged edges of the dough, my focus entirely on the clean, straight lines. 2 black coffees and whatever that twisted thing with the sugar is, a voice said. My hand froze. The metal edge of the scraper bit into the wooden cutting board, sticking firmly. It was a voice I had spent 4 years listening to. A voice that used to dictate my moods, my schedule, and my entire sense of self-worth. It was the voice that had driven me to bake a frantic, desperate 6-hour tart just to earn a passing glance. Slowly I lifted my head. Owen stood at the counter. He was wearing a heavy charcoal wool overcoat, the collar turned up against the cold. The wind had messed up his perfectly styled hair. He looked exactly the same, yet profoundly different. The intimidating monolithic aura he used to hold in my mind had completely evaporated. He just looked like a guy in a coat. Next to him stood a woman. She was young, maybe 22, bundled in a thin, fashionable trench coat that was entirely inadequate for the winter chill. She was shivering slightly, looking up at Owen with wide, nervous, eager-to-please eyes. A phantom pain flared in my chest. It wasn't jealousy. It was a visceral, sickening pity. I knew exactly how her stomach felt right now, tied in anxious knots, hoping he wouldn't complain about the coffee, hoping he wouldn't sigh heavily if the line took too long. She was exactly who I used to be. Owen hadn't realized who was standing behind the counter yet. He was busy checking his phone, his thumb swiping aggressively across the screen. "That's a cardamom knot," I said. My voice was raspy from breathing in flour dust all morning. It was flat, unbothered, and completely stripped of the high-pitched fawning tone I used to use with him. Owen's head snapped up. His eyes locked onto mine. His thumb froze on the screen. For 3 long seconds, the bakery was completely silent, save for the hiss of the espresso wand behind me. I watched the recognition wash over his face, followed instantly by a rapid defensive calculation. He took in my messy hair, the flour caked into the seams of my apron, the dark circles under my eyes. He expected me to look broken. Instead, I looked solid. I looked real. Faye. He said the syllable stiff and awkward in his mouth. He glanced around the bustling, warm shop, as if trying to reconcile the failing, dirty bakery he had visited months ago with this thriving space. 2 coffees and a cardamom knot, I repeated, ignoring his greeting entirely. I picked up a pair of metal tongs, grabbed the knotted sugar-crusted pastry, and dropped it into a brown paper bag. The crinkle of the paper sounded deafening. "You're still here?" Owen managed, shoving his phone into his pocket. He leaned forward slightly, trying to drop his voice so his new girlfriend wouldn't hear. "I drove past the old apartment last week. Management said you never came back for the rest of your mail." "I don't need it," I said, punching the total into the register. $12.50. He stared at me, his jaw tightening. He hated being treated like a transaction. He hated that I wasn't dropping the tongs to ask how he was doing. He pulled out his wallet, sliding a $20 bill across the glass counter. "So, this is it then?" he asked, a familiar, condescending edge creeping back into his tone. He just couldn't help himself. Playing baker in the slums, I didn't flinch. I didn't feel the sudden rush of heat to my cheeks or the frantic urge to defend myself. I just felt bored. I took the 20, snapped the drawer open, and handed him his change. Our fingers didn't brush. "It's honest work," I said simply. I pushed the paper bag across the counter. The girl next to him reached for it, pulling the warm pastry out. She broke a piece off. The cardamom knot shattered beautifully, a million thin, buttery layers, flaking away, releasing a puff of aromatic spice steam. She took a bite. Her eyes widened instantly. "Oh my God," she mumbled, chewing. She nudged Owen. "Owen, try this. It's incredible. It's the best thing I've ever had." Owen frowned, looking irritated by her enthusiasm. He took the piece she offered him and put it in his mouth. I watched his throat swallow. I watched his eyes dart from the pastry in his hand to my flour-covered face. I saw the exact moment his brain registered the texture, the rich, complex layers of fermented butter, the sharp hit of the cardamom. It was objectively, undeniably perfect. It was everything he had always claimed my baking wasn't. He stopped chewing. He looked at me, a profound, sinking realization pooling in his dark eyes. He finally understood what he had thrown away. He opened his mouth, maybe to offer a backhanded compliment, maybe to try and build a bridge back to a woman who used to worship him. I didn't wait to hear it. I turned my back to him, wiping my floured hands on my apron. "Order up, Arthur," I called out, my voice steady and clear, cutting through the heavy tension like a knife through soft dough. I walked back to the prep bench, grabbed my rolling pin, and brought it down hard against the butter block. The heavy, satisfying thud echoed through the kitchen. I didn't look over my shoulder when the front door chimed, or when the cold air rushed in and faded away. I just kept rolling, shaping a life entirely my own, finally full. Did you enjoy Faye's ruthless awakening? There is a visceral, unmatched satisfaction in finally realizing that your worth isn't tied to the palate of someone committed to misunderstanding you. If Faye's journey from a frantic people pleaser to a woman who rules her own kitchen resonated with you, hit that like button. Share this story with anyone who needs a harsh but necessary reminder to stop offering their absolute best to people who only want the bare minimum. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more grounded, hard-hitting, reborn drama stories.